Alright, let's go ahead and begin your test 1 review. Just a reminder, your test is next week. It will be available Monday through Friday up until Friday at midnight or 11:59 p.m. It'll be 50 multiple choice questions and you'll have 2 hours to complete it. You have the entire week to do it, so just allot 2 hours or at least allot some time throughout the week to go ahead and complete your test. It'll be available. It'll be open book, so you have an opportunity to look through your book and search for the answers as you take your test. However, remember you only have 2 hours to complete it, so I wouldn't spend a lot of time actually looking through your book. Instead, I would recommend actually preparing for your test a little bit beforehand. And at least if you're watching this lecture video, at least I know that you've at least prepared a little bit. So that's a good start. Also, feel free to look through old YouTube videos. Be sure to look through all the slides and things like that if you need help reviewing for the test. If you have any questions about the test or the format or anything, you have a number of ways to get a hold of me, so feel free to do so. Let's go ahead and begin your test 1 review. Remember, we started off, we're going to go ahead and go chronologically. We're going to start with week 1 and work up to week 4. We started in week 1 just talking about politics in general and what politics is, and also about what the study of government is. So that's where we started off with political science. Political science is just basically the study of government. Now, political science belongs to the behavioral sciences, so it belongs in the category along with sociology and psychology and those sorts of things. Behavioral sciences is a subset of sciences that is different from, say, the physical sciences, the environmental sciences, even chemistry and physics and things like that. Behavioral sciences includes a lot of different disciplines, but political science specifically only focuses on the political decisions and behavior of society and its people. So it focuses on voting patterns and political decisions and how people act within the political realm and things like that. If you remember from week 1, we broke it down into empirical and normative. Empirical, if you remember, was the idea that we are going to look at statistics and data and see how and observe how the world really is using those facts, and then make conclusions about the trends within the world and where the world is going based on that data as well. On the flip side of that, there was normative. Normative political science tends to focus a lot more on philosophical type questions. You know, what is justice, what is virtue, and then how do those values and ideas that we hold dear, how does that influence our policy decisions? So there's empirical political science, which relies on facts and data, and then there's a normative political science, which is much more of a philosophical approach to politics. We talked about what the definition of politics is, and the definition of politics, and I can guarantee this will be on your test, comes from Harold Laswell. His definition of politics is who gets what, when, and how. So politics encompasses people, it encompasses policies, it encompasses timelines, and it encompasses the actual following through on the policy. How does those policies and resource allocations go about? We talked about different types of governments in week 1 as well. I won't put all of these on your test by any means, but be sure to know at least a few of these. At least a few of these will be on your test, and so it's good to have at least a basic knowledge of these, so that way when you see them on your test, you can be sure of your answer. Now, the different types of government, we talked about a subset of only having one ruler under autocracy. Autocracy is the definition of having one ruler. And under autocracies, there's different types. There's tyranny, there's authoritarian, and there's totalitarian. But under autocracy, we need to start with a basis of having no ruler. Having no ruler is a system of anarchy, and this just means that there's absolutely no ruler, there's no guidance for society, it's kind of a chaotic system where there's no rule of law. And when there's no rule of law, you have a lot of chaos, and you don't really have a direction for the society to go. And that's why establishing a government is so important. Now, there's different types of government, and we talked about the one ruler ones. There's tyranny. Tyranny is a single ruler with absolute power, and that absolute power is so extreme, it's so concentrated within that one person, that the rest of society is often ignored. And because they're ignored, you often, in many ways, results in a system of anarchy, because the people feel left out, they're just kind of left to guide themselves with no real direction. And so tyranny, ironically, in many ways also leads to anarchy, even though there is one ruler in place. We talked about authoritarian governments. Authoritarian governments are where you do have one ruler, an overarching ruler, but they're restrained by other social institutions. And so the example that I gave there is Iran. You have a president of Iran, but he's solely responsible to the Islamic leaders within Iran. So he's restrained by the social institutions that are set up by the religious establishment in Iran. That'd be an example of authoritarian government. There's a totalitarian government also. A totalitarian government is just a government that seeks to eliminate all challengers. So this government, if it sees rebellious activity, it tends to squash that. If it sees that the church is getting too powerful, or maybe a religious institution is getting too powerful, it seeks to squash that as well. The example that I brought here was Syria. Bashar al-Assad is the leader of Syria, and he is very wary of any rebellious movements within his country, so he often resorts to war, and that's why Syria is kind of a hotbed for civil war, and it's definitely the Syrian civil war. If you have some free time to study that, it's definitely very interesting because you have all these different factions fighting against one another for control of the government, but Bashar al-Assad is the leader, and he's seeking to eliminate all those rebellious activities. We talked about government types of the few, and under the few you have the aristocracy and the oligarchy. The aristocracy is much more of a traditional system. It resided a lot more with feudal systems, where you just have these leaders that are chosen by birth or nobility, so therefore they are the leaders, and therefore they oversee the land. So it's kind of a lineage sort of thing, a heritage sort of thing, where leaders are chosen by their birth or divine right. There's an oligarchy as well. Oligarchy serves to serve just the few as well. Oligarchy is just a small group of rulers. So normally if you have a military junta or a coup d'etat, those are sorts of oligarchies where you just have these small group, and if you're in the group, you're going to benefit. If you're outside the group, you're not going to benefit. And the leaders of an oligarchy tend to only make laws that benefit themselves. We also talked about democracy. Democracy is rule of the many. So we went from up here with autocracy to having one, to aristocracy to having few, to democracy. And that's the rule by the citizens, rule for the many. Now, whether that's a true form of democracy, where everyone votes on every policy that ever comes up, or whether that's a representative form of democracy, where we vote leaders and representatives to represent our views for us, those are all fall under the term of democracy, because you do have a certain degree of citizen participation. There's very few examples of true democracy, but a lot of examples of representative democracy. And so when we talk about democracy today, we tend to focus just on the representative form of democracy. But that being said, as long as you have a certain degree where a large amount of citizens, many citizens are participating, then that's a form of democracy. We also moved on, we talked about political culture, political efficacy, and political knowledge. I can guarantee each of these will be on your test for sure. Political culture, we defined as just the broadly shared values, beliefs, and attitudes about how the government should function. So we as a society have different shared values and beliefs. Remember we talked about liberty and equality, and we talked about how those form our attitudes about how the government should function. We talked about political efficacy. Political efficacy is very important because it forms the basis of all of this pretty much. Political efficacy, by definition, is just the public's belief that they can influence government. So if you have a high level of political efficacy, you have a lot of people believing that they can influence government. If you have a low level of political efficacy, not a lot of people tend to care about politics, and they don't really feel frustrated, they feel left out, and so they don't believe that they can influence the government at all. Political efficacy is very important for a democracy. You need to have the public believing that they can influence the government somehow, because if they believe that, then they're going to actually participate. Now, if you look at authoritarian governments and things like that, they tend to not have a high level of political efficacy, so there's not a lot of overturn at all. We also talked about political knowledge. Political knowledge, by definition, is just the accumulation of information and experience about political processes. So political knowledge, whether you have a high level of political knowledge or a low level of political knowledge, it's all about the aggregate of information and experiences you have about politics. Hopefully by the end of this course you'll have a high level of political knowledge, and so therefore high level of political efficacy, and contribute to the political culture. We talked about political ideology, and remember when we talked about political ideology, we talked about it in two different ways. We talked about the world political ideology, and we talked about the American political ideology. In the world political ideology, I presented with this line, and if you also remember, I presented it in the form of what's called the political circle. So if you want to take this line and curl it up, if you want to curl the left side up there and the right side up there, you can also think about world political ideology that way. But traditionally it's been represented on this line, and on the left here you have the extreme end of the left, you have communism, and I'm not talking about Marx communism versus real world communism is much different than one another. But that being said, I used Stalin as the personification of communism. Now, if you remember Stalin, he killed 20 million of his own people, so he's a brutal dictator, even though he's within a communist system. And then over here on the right, I talked about fascism, and I used Hitler as the personification of fascism. He killed 6 million of his own people. So either way, if you get on the extreme ends of the left or the right, you tend to see mass killings and genocide and just terrible human rights atrocities. So that's why some people will curl these up and say they're pretty much the same thing, right? Well, they're not exactly the same thing, but they do tend to lead to the same sort of results. However, here in America, we're neither on the far left or on the far right, even though you could probably read online about name calling and things like that. We're nowhere near the extreme ends here. American political ideology rests within liberalism. And if you remember when I talked about liberalism, I talked about the difference between liberalism with a small L and then liberalism with a big L. Liberalism with a small L is just the idea basically of John Locke, that everyone has personal worth and personal dignity and are rational beings and can think for themselves. And that's what liberalism with a small L is. And it's different than liberalism with a big L, which tends to focus on the American political ideology of liberalism, which we're going to talk about here in just a little bit. With that being said, liberalism with a big L in America is right here on this left hash, and then conservatism with a capital C in the American political ideology is right here on the right hash. And you can see how close they are together. There's not a lot of difference, quite honestly, from liberals and conservatives here in America. But we have this great divide, and it's because of this political square. Now, I talked about this on week 1, so hopefully you guys remember this just a little bit, but I'm going to go ahead and review it because I can guarantee there's going to be a question about each of these on your test. If you remember when we talked about American political ideology, we said that here in America, we tend to break down issues among economic lines and also social lines. So economic issues or social issues. And the way we translate our political values of liberty and equality differ whether we're talking about an economic issue or a social issue. So when you talk about equality economically, but liberty on social issues, we tend to be within the liberal camp. So the liberal camp here in America wants equality on economic issues. They tend to promote social welfare programs, they tend to promote business regulation, and they tend to promote higher tax policies because they want equality. They want everything to be equal economically. Not to say a completely communist system, but at least a fairer chance. We'll say that much. But when you talk about social issues, they don't want the government to interfere there. They want the government to interfere on economic issues, but not on social issues. So they don't want a definition of traditional marriage, and they tend to be pro-life, so they tend to be pro-choice, so they don't want the government to interfere on their rights to seek an abortion. And also, they tend to want the government out of marijuana regulation as well. So those are the 3 social issues I can typically think of. There's a lot of social issues out there, but those tend to be the highlight of American political debates today. On the opposite end, though, you have conservatives. And conservatives want liberty on economic issues. So they want the government to stay out of business. They want the government to lower their taxes. And they also don't tend to they don't tend to favor social welfare programs. So they want liberty economically, but they want equality socially. So they tend to be pro-life. They tend to want a definition of traditional marriage. And they also tend to favor the government interfering on marijuana regulation and things like that. Like I said, you can probably think of a number of social issues, but those are the main 3 that are coming to my mind right now. So when we talk about even though we talk about why they're so close here, the reason why they are so divided here is because in order for them to find middle ground, like I talked about on week 1, they have to sacrifice 2 of their political values, and that's very, very difficult to sacrifice 2 of your political values and try to find some middle ground. Values are something that we hold very personal and dear to ourselves, so to sacrifice even 1 is very difficult. But let's say you were to sacrifice 1, then you would be moving into the libertarian or the populist camp. The libertarian camp, with the libertarian square down here, libertarians tend to favor liberty on both economic and social issues. So they want liberty on economic issues. They don't want the government to interfere in business. They don't want higher taxes. And they also don't tend to favor social welfare programs. They also want liberty on social issues, though, so they want the government to stay out of those as well. So they tend to be pro-choice, and they tend to not favor a definition of traditional marriage. So they want liberty. They want liberty on all fronts. They want the government to stay out of everything. Now that's kind of a paradox in many ways, because in order to have a libertarian ideology, you have to care about politics and government. And in order to promote your libertarian ideology, you need to elect people to government, even though you are anti-government. So there's kind of a paradox within the libertarian camp. But that being said, the libertarian camp is an increasingly growing sector here in society, and so it's definitely something to keep your eye on, is how the growth of the libertarian camp is going to affect both the liberal and the conservative ideology, because they take elements from both they take elements from both the liberal and conservative camps. Now over here on the top right corner, you also have the populists, and the populists used to be very popular in the South and the Midwest, because they wanted government to help them out economically, because they were farmers and they liked subsidies and things like that. But they were also come from a very Protestant tradition, and so they tended to have the more moralistic and Protestant ideas about government interference on equality and social issues as well. So populists, while they tend to favor social welfare programs, they tend to favor higher taxes, and they also tend to favor business regulation. They also want equality on social issues, so they tend to be pro-life, and they tend to support traditional marriage and things like that. So populists, while they're not as popular as they were today, there's definitely still a strain of populism around, and a lot of our political ideologies or political traditions come actually from the populist camp, especially here in Texas. I would definitely say populism is you can still see strains of populism here in Texas today. But those are the 4 American political ideologies, and so we talked about each of those, and there will be a question about each of those on your test, so be sure to at least understand where this square comes from. This square won't be on your test directly, but there will be questions about which one favors equality and liberty on economic and social issues, and so be sure to understand that. And if you need further review, go back to the week 1 lecture, and there is further explanations, and maybe that'll help you understand it. Moving on to week 2, though, we talked about different political thought. We talked about constitutional government. And a constitutional government is just rule in which formal and effective limits are placed on governmental power. So that's the definition of a constitutional government. And almost all governments are a constitutional government. All governments tend to have a constitution, because you need to place these formal and effective limits on governmental power. Now, while most governments today have a constitution and tend to have a form of constitutional government, the very first time, or the very first kind of sort of constitution, I guess I would say, remember we talked about the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was the first time a ruler had agreed to have formal limits placed on their power by their subjects. Before then, there was no idea of a constitution. There was just rulers, and then whatever they said was what went. But the Magna Carta, we talked about King Henry. Yeah, sorry, I forget which kings. There's so many kings, I kind of forget that sometimes. But the Magna Carta placed those limits because he was taxing his barons so much, and the barons did not like that, so they said, this king is out of control, we need to place some limits on him. So for your test, at least know that the Magna Carta was the first time that a ruler had agreed to have formal limits placed on him by their subjects. We also talked about classical liberalism. I talked about classical liberalism quite a bit on the last slide when we talked about political ideology. But classical liberalism is, once again, just the idea that individuals have worth and dignity, they are rational beings, they can reason with one another, and they have virtue and common sense as well. So that's the idea of classical liberalism, and that really comes out of John Locke. But remember, we talked about Hobbes and Locke, and they have different views on how the government should function and what the purpose of government is. Hobbes would say that individuals have a right to everything prior to the government. So they have a right to everything. You can plunder, you can pillage, you can kill one another for your resources. You have a right to everything. It is your right to do that, but you're going to have to harm others. And when in this state of nature, when you have people killing one another for resources, life is definitely brutish and short. Now, that's no way to live, is kind of what Hobbes thought. He thought this is brutal, it's short, it's barbaric in many ways. He said that we need to establish a government. We need to give up all rights once the government is established so that the government will protect us. Remember I talked about the Leviathan and how the Leviathan sat on the edge of the sea, and if someone did wrong, the Leviathan would reach out one of its tentacles and punish the wrongdoer. That's how Hobbes saw government. Hobbes saw government as this thing that sits out there. We don't really sense it all the time, but we know it's there. Because the reason why we're not killing each other today is because the government is there to protect us. And so that's how the government is in Hobbes's mind, is that it's there, even though we don't always see it. But if we do wrong, the Leviathan is going to reach out his arm and kind of bring the arm of justice, for kind of a metaphor there. Locke, on the other hand, really subscribed to the idea of classical liberalism, and he thought that individuals have a right to what they labor for. They have a right to enjoy their work, to pursue happiness, is where Locke comes in, and that individuals are reasonable. He said that people do not give up all their rights in the society, and that the government is just there to protect our right to life, liberty, and property. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as it was translated into the Declaration of Independence. But he said that we're not going to kill one another. We just need government there to help us along. The government will take care of certain duties for us so that we can continue enjoying our life, being rational beings, and enjoy the fruits of our labor. And that's kind of the difference between Locke and Hobbes. Locke is much more optimistic about human nature. Hobbes is a lot more pessimistic about human nature. So, for the purpose of your test, please know the difference between Hobbes and Locke and how they viewed government in the state of human nature. That's the key thing to know for your test. Moving on to, I guess, kind of continuing the tradition of Locke. I didn't realize I had this slide on here, but continuing the tradition of Locke, human beings are thought to be rational actors, and they make decisions based on costs and benefits. So we've kind of carried on the tradition of classical liberalism, and here in America we definitely agree with classical liberalism. Remember, liberalism with a small l. And so how we view classical liberalism, because we're rational actors, we're human beings and we can reason, we tend to look at things in terms of costs and benefits. So you watching this review lecture is a benefit to you because you're going to do better on your test. It may be a cost in terms of time and things like that, but apparently since you're watching this video, you thought the benefit outweighed the cost. And we do this in all sorts of things. We do it with food, we do it with purchasing a new car, we do it with clothes, everything. We always weigh things in terms of costs and benefits. But the thing that sets us sets us apart and makes us very unique as human beings is that we do this process of utility maximization. And this is the idea that when we weigh costs and benefits, we want to get the greatest good or happiness for the least amount of cost. You want the best deal. That's why you go to Black Friday sales, and that's why you try to seek out the best deal for a car and things like that. You want the greatest good and happiness for the least amount of cost. You don't want to spend too much to be miserable. Instead, you want to spend less to be very happy. Now, that's I can guarantee that for your test, the definition of utility maximization will be on there. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the types of different democracies. And this democracy really stems from the idea of classical liberalism, that we should give rights to people because they are rational beings and can make decisions about what's good about government and what's bad about government and can vote accordingly. And that's where democracy comes in, and that's why it belongs into this political thought kind of idea. Now, we talked about different types. We talked about direct democracy. Direct democracy is where individual citizens vote directly on all laws and policies, and there are very few examples of this because for the average individual citizen to actually know everything would be a huge cost. And going back to this whole cost and benefits thing, it would be a huge cost, it'd be very time consuming, and it wouldn't give us much benefit, to be quite honest. Instead, we have representative democracy. Representative democracy, we have elected officials, and they're the ones that make decisions for us. Eligible voters are the ones that vote these people in, and they are the ones who decide who gets elected to make decisions for the public. And this is based on a Republican form of government, a small r, not a capital R, and please note the difference of that as well. We talked about incentive versus referendum. Both of those are thought to increase citizen participation because citizens are actually voting directly on laws. I gave you examples of what the difference between an initiative and a referendum is. But whenever there's a major changing law, it tends to be either an initiative or a referendum where people vote directly whether it should be a law or not. And they go to the ballot boxes, and they're the ones that actually make the legislative decision on those laws. Now, we talked about different definitions of democracy. These actually probably will be on your test, so be sure to know these. We talked about Carl Cohen's definition. Remember, he talked about democracy in terms of breadth, range, and depth. I won't go into extreme detail there, but be sure to review those for your test, what breadth, range, and depth is and who did those. Carl Cohen is the one that attributed definitions of democracy to breadth, range, and depth. We also talked about Samuel Huntington. Samuel Huntington didn't look at breadth, range, and depth. He said instead we should just look at elections. Are elections fair and contested, and can people freely participate in those elections? As long as you meet those two definitions, you are a democracy. If you have fair and free elections and you have people that can participate freely and express themselves, you're a democracy. That's rule of the people. People are allowed to express themselves and vote accordingly. And then we finally talked about Freedom House. Freedom House was a little bit different. Freedom House didn't look at breadth, range, and depth, and they didn't look at elections. Instead, they just looked at political rights and civil liberties. Are the people at large allowed to exercise their political rights, and do they have a certain amount of civil liberties that makes them a free people? And as long as you have that, then you are a democracy. So I won't get into too much detail on the test about these. Just know who did which, and which one focuses on what. So what would Carl Cohen focus on? He would focus on breadth, range, and depth. What would Samuel Huntington focus on? What would Freedom House focus on? Just know that for the purpose of your test. We moved on to week 3. We talked about the U.S. Constitution, and I can guarantee this definition of a constitution will be on your test. What is a constitution? Well, by definition, the Constitution is just an authoritative text that sets out the principles, authorities, and rights that are established by the government. So you want to set out certain principles. What does your nation believe in? What does your government believe in? You want to set out authorities. You want to say that the government can do this, and it can't do this, and it has the power, and it has the regulations and things like that. You also want to set out certain rights. You want to ensure that your people are free from government control in certain ways, and you want to be sure that people have certain rights to do as they wish and to express themselves and things like that. And all of these are established by the government because the government embodies the Constitution, and in many ways the Constitution is the government. So it's kind of a reciprocal relationship. Definition number 2, it probably won't be on your test, but I still think it's very important, a written charter that sets forth the limits on government, because you need to have a written charter that ensures that your people are free and have certain rights, just as I talked about with this definition right here. And in many ways, the Constitution sets out limits on who gets to do what, to whom, and how. If you go back to Harold Laswell's definition of politics, a Constitution should embody politics in the nation and how the politics of the nation is going to function. And so that's kind of why you also get out a Constitution that does this. It sets out the limits on who gets to do what, to whom, and how. If you remember Harold Laswell's definition of politics, who gets what, when, and how, that's in many ways the same thing with the Constitution. We went through a lot of U.S. history. We talked about the Mayflower Compact. We talked about how the Mayflower Compact was the first charter written by citizens in the New World. Remember, they had become blown off the course, and they were in uncharted territory according to the British law. So now they're in uncharted territory. They're not within the rule of British law. We need to set out rules that way. Once we get off this boat, we can govern ourselves effectively, and that's what the Mayflower Compact was. So it's very important to the development of U.S. history, because this was the first time people had kind of ruled themselves in the New World, and it had set out what could be done. So for the purpose of your test, just know that the Mayflower Compact was the first charter written by citizens in the New World so that they could govern themselves in this uncharted territory. We talked about the lead up to the American Revolution, and also to the American Constitution, therefore. But remember, we talked about how Great Britain they began taxing their colonists because of the cost with the French and Indian Wars. They needed to raise revenue, and so the easiest way to raise revenue was to tax the colonists. We talked about different acts. We talked about the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and then we also talked about the mass demonstrations with the Boston Tea Party and so forth. After the Boston Tea Party and after these demonstrations and protests, the British government comes down even harder. They come down with the Intolerable Acts, and which led to a lot of sentiment for the revolution, basically. We had talked about the First Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress was a response to the Intolerable Acts. This was the very first time where we talked about revolution. And during the First Continental Congress, we had the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And the British absolutely slaughtered the American forces at Lexington and Concord. And this was seen as an even more provoking action by the British government. That's where we get the Second Continental Congress. After Lexington and Concord, this is a serious deal. The British are actually attacking citizens of the colonies, or are actually attacking colonists now, and so we need to set up a Continental Congress to actually seriously discuss the idea of independence. From the Second Continental Congress, you get the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is founded on unalienable rights, John Locke. It's put into the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson ends up being the father of the Declaration, even though Robert Livingston was the one that was actually supposed to write it, but he had to go back to New York. But please note, at least for the Declaration of Independence, please note that it's different from the U.S. Constitution. It's often confused, but it's way different. This is just our declaring independence. This isn't us establishing a government. This is just our Declaration of Independence from the British government. After the Declaration of Independence, we take up arms, we fight the Revolutionary War. We barely win, but we do win, thanks to the help of the French and thanks to General Washington. And so Revolutionary War is fought and won, and we can now set up our own government. Our first attempt at setting up a government was the Articles of Confederation, and the Articles of Confederation was America's first constitution. It set up this confederation model of government. Remember when we talked about with federalism, we talked about confederation systems. We're going to go ahead and review that in just a little bit. But know that the Articles of Confederation was America's first written constitution. It sets up this confederation system with a weak national government, and most of the powers are reserved to the state. The state government has full power of execution of the laws, and unfortunately, this creates a lot of confusion and a lot of lack of coordination between the states. They have to set up their own currency, they have to set up their own tariffs, they have to basically prop up their own economy, and they have to set up their own laws as well. And there's so much chaos. There's just no coordination between the states. And so it leads to this highly ineffective government. And states are very weak also. Because they're trying to prop up their own economies without help from a federal government, they can't quite do it. And they're very weak, and that's where you get Shays' Rebellion. Remember I talked about Shays' Rebellion? And how Shays' Rebellion pointed out just how weak states are. The states couldn't establish their own militia to fight a citizen rebellion. So that kind of scares the crap out of a lot of these states, and they recognize that we need to set up a new constitution and maybe set up a stronger government than we previously thought. And that's why we get the Constitutional Convention. Remember I talked about with the Constitutional Convention that elites played a very important role at the Constitutional Convention? And that's something to keep in mind, is how the U.S. government was set up to help out the elites rather than the common man. Because the elites were very concerned about the common man, and they were concerned about another Shays' Rebellion where the common man can just rebel against them. That kind of, like I said, it really scared the crap out of them. The Constitution embodies these 5 ideas. I won't go into complete detail with each of these. Sets up the idea of popular sovereignty, that people should participate in government. It sets up limited government, that while we need a strong government, we also need to place certain limits so that we don't set up a new king or a new tyrant that we just fought. They were really scared of that we should have limited government. To help out with limiting the government, they set up a separation of powers. So they divided the authority between the 3 branches, the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. This meant that each branch had a unique power and could set up the system of checks and balances. The 4th idea, the checks and balances, is just the idea that each branch of government is given certain powers and can check on the power of the other, or can limit the power to prevent one branch of government from becoming too powerful. They were really worried about that executive branch in particular, and because they really thought that maybe we just set up a new king. But if we have the legislative branch and the judicial branch bearing down on the executive branch, then we can prevent a new king from coming into power. And then finally, they also set up the idea of federalism, and we're going to go ahead and review that with week 4. But federalism was just the idea that we need to have federal power, but we also need to have the states have some power as well. Things to know about the Constitutional Convention and about the Constitution in general. Remember the Great Compromise, the Connecticut Compromise. I really, really want you to know that. The Great Compromise was a compromise from the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan. Please know the difference between the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan. The New Jersey plan, New Jersey was a small state. New Jersey wanted equal representation, regardless of population. They said all states should be equal. All states should have 2 votes per state because population doesn't matter. All states should be equal. As long as you're in the union, you are of equal status. Virginia said, no way. Having two representatives per state, that's unfair to us. Because now you only have, if you have you have 2 representatives per state, you have a different ratio in different states. And Virginia was one of the largest states, and so also Virginia wanted a large number of seats. Being the largest state, it would have the largest number of seats. So the Virginia plan said that representation should be based on population. If you're a larger state, you should get more representation. If you're a smaller state, you should get less representation. Now that's where the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, comes in. It says, hey, we don't need to have just a unicameral Congress. What we need to have instead is maybe a bicameral Congress. And so this translated into the House of Representatives and the Senate. The Virginia plan got translated into the House of Representatives. It said, hey, if you're a larger state, you should have more representation. So you'll have more representation in the House of Representatives. The New Jersey plan was thrown into the Senate. In the Senate, every state has 2 representatives. And so that's why the New Jersey plan is the Senate, basically, where every state in the Senate has 2 representatives. So you can kind of group these 2 together, the Great Compromise and the New Jersey and Virginia plans. And then the final one was the 3/5 Compromise. The founders had to deal with the issue of slavery. Because remember, representation is based on population with the Virginia plan. How do we count slaves for the purpose of representation? So they come up with the 3/5 Compromise. And what they do is they say every slave should be counted as 3/5 of a person. Now, the North agrees to this because it's at least it's a majority. It's not by any means a full person, but at least it's a majority. And the South likes it because at least it's not a full person. We're not giving them full rights by any means. So for purpose of counting the slaves, they came up with a 3/5 Compromise. I can guarantee there'll be a question on that as well. So there'll be a question on all 3 of these things, so be sure to know all of these for purposes of your test. We broke down, we had quite a lengthy discussion on week 3 about the different articles of different articles within the Constitution. So just be sure to know which one does what. Article 1 sets up the legislative branch. Article 2 sets up the executive branch. Article 3 sets up the judicial branch. Now, with these 3, I want you to at least understand the concept of checks and balances. I don't want you to be able to relay to me exactly what they do in terms of check and balances. Just know that checks and balances is the idea that these 3 balance out each other, so that way each one of these does not become too big or too powerful. That's the concept of checks and balances. We moved on to Article 4, national unity. Please at least know what the full faith and credit clause is. It just says that if something happens legally in one state, and then they move to another state, it needs to be recognized in that state. That's the full faith and credit clause. Article 5 covers how to pass amendments. I'm not going to ask you the exact process for how to pass an amendment. I just want you to know that in Article 5, that's how to pass an amendment. It's laid out within Article 5. Article 6 is the Supremacy Clause. I definitely want you to know that. We're going to talk about that more with Federalism. The Supremacy Clause is very important to the idea of Federalism. And then Article 7, how to ratify the Constitution. I want you to know, for the purpose of your test, that 9 out of the 13 states had to ratify. 9 out of the 13 states had to ratify. 9 out of the 13 states ratified the Constitution within the first year, and then Rhode Island was the very last one in 1790. Just know that 9 out of the 13 states had to ratify. All right, we finally move into week 4 with Federalism. Federalism, we talked about the 3 different types of government systems. We talked about a confederation system, a unitary system, and then the system of federalism. So with the confederation system, we kind of already talked a little bit about this with the U.S. Articles of Confederation. But the confederation system is just where states have most of the authority. So you may have a national government that oversees everything, but all the power is within the states. And so states have most of the authority within the confederation system. There are very few examples worldwide of a confederation system. So that's why the only one that really matters is that the U.S., this was the system the U.S. had under the Articles of Confederation. Now, you might have a unitary system as well. Unitary system is where you may have state and regional governments, but they don't have a lot of power. Instead, the majority of the authority, sorry, that's kind of a tricky term, majority of the authority resides within control of the national government. And if you remember from the lecture, I also said that unitary systems also tend to be parliamentary systems. And that's why all these examples are parliamentary systems. Now, when you combine both a confederation system and a unitary system to meet in the middle, you get a system of federalism. And federalism is just where you have powers that are granted to each level of the government over the same body of citizens. So even if you have a federal government that oversees the same body of citizens as the state government, but the federal government and the state government each have certain powers delegated to them. So let's go ahead and tackle that right now. Let's look over here onto the left-hand column with the federal system. Now, the federal system has certain powers granted to it, and it's granted to them by the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8. Article 1, Section 8 outlines these three powers for the federal government. And the federal government has the power to tax and spend. They have the power to promote interstate commerce and interstate commerce if there's a national interest at hand. And then also the federal government has the power to do what is necessary and proper to promote national unity. Now, that can, like I said, the necessary and proper clause can be very tricky at times. But also remember that I added the 14th Amendment, and we're going to go ahead and talk about that here in just a little bit. But thanks to the 14th Amendment, the federal government also has a fourth power of stopping discrimination in state law. Now, Article 6 is the one that grants the federal power the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause says that if there's ever a contradiction between federal law and state law, the federal law is the one that is supreme to the state law. So if it ever goes to the Supreme Court and there's a case between a state government and a federal government, the Supreme Court has to rule on the side of the federal government because it is the supreme law of the land over the state's policies. Now, that's not to say the states can't make laws that contradict federal law, but if there was a case, then we know which one would win. And the states do still have certain powers. The state governments can retain the remainder of power not allocated to the national government. So if it's not within one of these three clauses and it's not within the 14th Amendment, then the state governments have that power. They retain that power. The certain examples of power that I said here were they have oversight of elections, they are the ones that set the school curriculums, they're the ones that set the definition of marriage, and they also establish local governments. All of the state power derives from the 10th Amendment, and the 10th Amendment says that powers that are not expressed in the Constitution are reserved to the states or the people. And that's where the state governments really get their power, is the 10th Amendment. With the 10th Amendment, states have certain powers. Because they're not expressed in the Constitution, they're reserved to the states. Now, we talked about different types of powers, and you'll have to forgive me. During my lecture, I said they're expressed powers. Some people also call them delegated powers, so you can use those interchangeably. There's delegated powers and express powers. So, for purposes of today's lecture, we'll just go ahead and call them delegated powers. But delegated powers are powers that are delegated just to the national government by the Constitution. Remember, we already covered these. We talked about taxing and spending, we talked about the Commerce Clause, and we talked about the Necessary and Proper Clause. Also, the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment allows the federal government a new power, or did at the time allow them a new power to prevent discrimination among the states, of the state to its citizens. So those are delegated. Then you can meet in the middle. You can meet in the middle with powers that are exercised by both the states and the federal government, and those are considered concurrent powers. Concurrent powers are shared by the federal government and the state government. So both the federal and state governments tax, both the state and federal governments establish highways, and both the state and federal governments police. There's many more. If you want to go ahead and review the lecture on federalism and go back and look at those, there are many powers that they actually do share just beyond those, eminent domain and things like that being some of those. Then, moving even further to just state powers. Those are called reserved powers, powers reserved to the states. Education, marriage laws, local government, elections, and things like that. All those are types of reserved powers. So there's delegated, concurrent, and reserved. And I want you to know what delegated powers are and who gets to exercise those, what concurrent powers are and who gets to exercise those, and what reserved powers are and who gets to exercise those. So be sure to understand those different types of powers that are set up in this system of federalism. Now, we went ahead and talked about a number of court cases that dealt with both current issues and establishing powers as well. So the very first one we talked about was McCulloch versus Maryland. This was a very important case because it was one of the very first cases that dealt with federalism and which government should have that power to do that certain act. Now, McCulloch versus Maryland. If you remember, the federal government wanted to establish a national bank. And they tried to establish this national bank, but they did it on state grounds within Maryland's territory. Maryland said, no, we don't want a national bank here, and they challenged the federal government over whether the federal government can charter a national bank or not. Well, the decision comes back and it says the federal government actually can charter a national bank, and because a national bank is necessary and proper to the national interest, it's necessary for a government to thrive and to raise revenue, and that's why a national bank is important for the government to establish. So this established the necessary and proper clause for the federal government, and it also established that states cannot tax national banks. So states cannot tax national entities because if states continued to tax national banks, or they were allowed to tax national banks, they could ultimately destroy the national government. So that's why McCulloch versus Maryland was so important, particularly as the very first case that dealt with federalism and ensured that the nation could generate revenue to continue to thrive at that time. So that I can guarantee that'll definitely be on your test. Also on your test will be U.S. versus Lopez. This is a very important case. It's also a very intriguing case because it happened here in Texas. And this just basically said that the federal government cannot regulate firearms that stay within state boundaries. And it also this federal law that banned firearms on campuses does not meet criteria of the Commerce Clause. If you remember, it was too onerous to assume that carrying a gun on campus disrupted the school day, which disrupted a student's entire education, which then disrupted the entire economy. So this was a huge win for gun rights advocates, and it said that the federal government cannot regulate firearms. Now, states can, but the federal government cannot. We moved on to the issue of immigration. We talked about immigration. We talked about how only the federal government can regulate and enforce immigration laws. Arizona wanted to try to enforce immigration laws, but it could not. And the reason why is because the U.S. is the only one that can deal with other sovereign nations. They're the only ones that can deal with foreign nations. And so it's the U.S.'s duty to enforce immigration, not the states. Now, this was important for Texas as well because Texas is a border state and often tries to talk about the issue of immigration, even though it's a federal issue only. States cannot enforce their own immigration laws was the main ruling from Arizona versus the U.S. So that one will probably be on your test for sure, particularly you guys being from Texas. It's very important to keep in mind. We also talked about Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, whichever one you want to call it. This was Florida versus the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Remember, this is the whole reason why the Affordable Care Act has stayed and why everyone is now required to own health insurance or to at least be covered by your parents' insurance as well. So for college students, it's very important to keep in mind because you guys are approaching the age of 26 where you guys will have to be off of your parents' health insurance by that time. And so it could be very important for those when you consider health insurance in the future. But anyways, going back to the facts of the case, remember, this case said that Congress cannot pass the ACA under the Commerce Clause, but it can under the Taxing and Spending Clause. It is within the rights of Congress to enforce this individual mandate, to enforce that everyone have health insurance, because Congress can impose taxing, can impose new taxes, and this was seen as a new tax. And the individual mandate was a tax, but the fee was not a huge burden. It wasn't so coercive as to be a huge burden to the people. And it's important for people to have health insurance so that when they go and seek those healthcare services, they'll have a way to pay for them. So that was the ruling, and that's why the Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act stays around today, and everyone is now required to have health insurance or pay a penalty. We also talked about the issue of marijuana legalization and marijuana regulation. We talked about U.S. versus Reich 2005. This basically said that the federal government can regulate medicinal marijuana even if it's only purely interstate. And the reason why is because it was thought that if the U.S. government does not control marijuana here in California or there in California, it will then spread and become a national problem. That's the way the Supreme Court looked at it. Also keep in mind that the Supreme Court looked at it in terms of the Supremacy Clause. This was a federal law versus a state law, the California law. And so the Supreme Court, due to the supremacy clause, had to read that and say that the supreme law of the land is the federal law, which is that marijuana is illegal. Now, this is going to be interesting, particularly as we see more states legalize marijuana and legalize recreational use, and even medicinal use for that matter. It'll be very interesting to see how the future administrations and the future courts handle it. There may be a time in which the federal government backs completely off, lets this kind of experiment happen with the laboratories of democracy, lets the experiment happen, and then changes their mind as well. So the Supreme Court for now, though, has to rule on the side of the federal government because the federal law is the supreme law of the land. We also talked about the 14th Amendment. We talked about how the 14th Amendment was a new power. It granted an additional power to the federal government in order to stop citizens from discriminating against their own citizens. This was, at the time, it was concerned with just the South and about how the South was going to treat newly freed slaves. But since then, many civil rights movements invoked the 14th Amendment. It was intended to prevent discrimination, and in many ways it can be invoked in many of the social movements that are happening today. We talked about local governments, how local governments are not in the Constitution, so that's something to keep in mind. Even though local governments are essential for state governments to function, and state governments are essential for federal government to function, the founders really left out local governments in the Constitution, which is very interesting, even though they knew that local governments were going to be essential to the way society functions in many ways. We went and talked about the many theories of federalism and the various eras of federalism, I guess I should say. We talked about layer cake federalism, also called dual federalism. For the purposes of your test, please know that dual federalism is also layer cake, and then marble cake is also cooperative federalism. But layer cake federalism was the system of federalism that lasted from 1789 up until 1937. And it basically said that federal and state governments have different layers. The national government is on top, the state governments are down below, and there may be a little interaction, but not a whole lot. And that lasted until 1937. The national government did what it did, the state governments did what it did, but then there came a time of economic crisis in which the state looked to the federal government for help, and that was during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, in which we had to have the state governments and the national government cooperate in order to pull us out of this economic crisis. And that's where marble cake federalism comes in, also called cooperative federalism. States began relying on the federal government for grants and help. We need grants to establish jobs, to establish worker programs, and to help out our citizens that are suffering. And the New Deal really marks the beginning. Many people will cite the New Deal as the start of marble cake federalism. With the help of the New Deal, states got a lot of grants, and grants and aid have increased dramatically. And this trend has continued all the way from the 1950s all the way up until today. Remember, we saw that one graph with that exponential curve where grants and aid have increased dramatically and have continued to do so. That being said, with these grants and aid, we've also given a lot of power back to the states, and that's where the term devolution comes in. And I really want you to know the term devolution for the purpose of your test, because devolution is the idea that we're giving power back to the states, but we're also giving them money to do so. So even though the federal government has more of its hand in state government, they're just doing it through the means of monetary help. They're giving them the money, but then the states have the power to do as they wish with that money in many ways. Often with these grants they do. So devolution, we're giving power back to the states. However, we're also helping them along with the federal government is also helping them along with the money as well. So please know the term devolution, that we're giving power back to the states, and that the term devolution really took off during the 1980s, during the Reagan administration, where the Reagan administration was so concerned about states' rights and things like that. So I believe that wraps up the lecture. Yes, it does. So remember, for your test, it is 50 multiple choice questions. You have 2 hours. It is open book, but please be sure to prepare ahead of time, so that way you're not thumbing through the entire exam and then you realize you don't have that much time left. If you need any help, if you have any questions about the material or maybe even the test itself, please get a hold of me. You have my email, you have my number. I'm available on Skype. I'm available on various forms of social media as well, so feel free to look me up. Embrace all forms of technology. However you want to get a hold of me, please feel free to do so. And that being said, Good luck with your test. I'm sure you'll do well, especially if you've watched all these lectures and reviewed all the materials. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude this lecture, and I will be back with a lecture next week.